Activation warning. This episode contains explicit and graphic descriptions of suicide, self-harm, sexual assault, and rape. Discretionary caution and action is required. This episode is not for children. Please use extreme self-care in listening to this episode and seek immediate help through the National Suicide Hotline by dialing 988 if you are emotionally activated or triggered by the content of this episode. Or if you are activated and need help from the National Sexual Assault Telephone Hotline, call 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-4673.
One of the things that I've learned about when dealing with trauma is that service is a fantastic way of working through trauma. Own your story, look for opportunities to help others.
Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, and thank you for joining me this week. This is episode 90, and my guest this week is Chris McGhee. Chris is not here as a victim or survivor of sexual assault, but rather to share the story of his daughter, who we refer to as G during the episode. The reason Chris and G wanted G's story told is because she was sexually assaulted by a York, Pennsylvania police officer. That, in and of itself, is disturbing enough. But what made it even worse for G and her family is that this police officer was able to walk out of the courtroom after his conviction with absolutely no jail as part of his sentence. The nuances of Pennsylvania law and the way the prosecutor's office charged this case made this possible. Chris and G are on a mission to change Pennsylvania law, specifically for how a law enforcement officer would be charged for a child sex crime in the state of Pennsylvania. Chris reached out to me to help get this story told in order to possibly help get the law changed, and I agreed to help get this story and this mission out to you because it could help other states with a similar problem when it comes to prosecuting cops who rape or sexually assault a child. Please listen to this episode, then share it so that others will be aware of the situation. Here's Chris. Chris McGhee, thank you for being part of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. I want to welcome you to the show. Thank you for being here and for being willing to tell us about the situation with your daughter.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate the opportunity to share our story and kind of bring some awareness to this issue.
Absolutely. So my audience knows, Chris reached out to me based on a situation with his daughter. I'm going to let him tell you about it instead of me giving you background. Chris, before we get into the story, tell us about yourself.
Dave, I am married. I have 3 daughters. We live in York, Pennsylvania. We've lived here for about 5-6 years. I am a manager of talent development at a company in Maryland. I do a lot of leadership development and a lot of training on soft skills, communication, and things of that nature. I spend my weekends tinkering in the garage, playing with my motorcycles and, fighting the crabgrass. So that's kind of what I do. I have to say I'm also a dad on a mission. I think that's probably the best way to put it. In 2019, my then 14-year-old daughter was sexually assaulted by a classmate. She was struggling. She was struggling with the trauma of what happened. She fell into a serious depression. And as a result, she tried to kill herself. My wife and I wanted to get her help. Obviously, she was hospitalized. And at that time, she did not want to move forward with pressing charges or anything like that because he was a popular boy and she was afraid of the shame and how it would look. But she was still struggling. My wife and I really wanted to surround her with positive people, wanted to help her get involved and to really counteract that depression. She was working with a therapist and we were doing the things that we thought we needed to do. We had learned of some community walks here in York that were hosted by the commissioner of police here. And it was about a half a dozen people, primarily officers, probation officers, as well as some community leaders. There were some social workers, some teachers, and ministers. And we heard about these walks and we thought, wow, what a great opportunity for her to be surrounded by people that are really seeing some not so good things, but are trying to build a better community, right? That they see the possibilities of people. And so we thought, wow, this would be perfect for her. On a weekly basis, my daughter and I would meet for these community walks through the downtown neighborhoods of York. On these walks, we got to know some of the officers and the police commissioner. And one of the officers in particular, who was also a student resource officer, really took an interest in my daughter. And we thought, this is fantastic. A young man, he was 28 years old, and he was a volunteer football coach. And his job is to work with at-risk youth. This just seemed like a no-brainer. My wife and I had shared with him some of the things that our daughter was struggling with. He really wanted to be a mentor. He really wanted to help her navigate these challenges. And so we thought, wow, this is fantastic. How lucky are we? So over the course of several months, he was building a relationship with our daughter and with my wife and I. Again, we couldn't have been happier about it. Over the course of the next several months, she continued to struggle. There was another suicide attempt. He reached out to her while she was in the hospital. As an officer, he was able to get through to her unit. And again, we just thought, well, how fantastic is this? What we learned several months later is that he had begun to sexually assault her. We did not know about it for another 6 months, maybe. And in the course of that, he was reminding her that you've already claimed to be sexually assaulted. So if you make a claim now that I'm sexually assaulting you, nobody's going to believe you. Plus, I'm an officer, so it's going to be my word against yours. And come on, I'm a cop. He also reminded her that he had the ability to influence my wife and I. He could see to it that she could be hospitalized again, and he could really make her life miserable. This went on for several months. Several months later, we found out about it. Immediately, because of the situation, because this was someone that was specifically supposed to be helping her and mentor her using his authority, we contacted the commissioner. So it was about 1 o'clock in the morning when we called him. We said what was going on, that Officer Palmer had been assaulting her. Within 30 minutes, we had detectives in our kitchen talking to us. I have to be very upfront on this aspect. We had absolute support from the police department. There was no question about believing what my daughter said. They jumped all over it. So began the process of pressing charges. The next day, we spent pretty much the entire day in the district attorney's office and began doing the interviews, and the investigations started. Fast forward a year and a half later, he received a plea deal to a corruption of a minor of a sexual nature, which is a misdemeanor charge. He received no jail time. He received no registration on the national database. He received 3 to 5 years of probation and a stern talking to by the judge saying, don't do it again. It's essentially what happened. And I got to tell you, Dave, watching him walk out of the courtroom was one of those seminal moments in my life where this is never going to happen again. This is so unacceptable. The man who acknowledged what he did, took responsibility for it, was then going home on his merry way. After the hearing, right outside the courtroom, several officers and the police commissioner were outside waiting to speak with us. And one of the officers came up to me and gave me a hug and said how sorry he was that this was it. And he said, if you're as angry about this as we are on the police department, you ought to consider changing the law. I thought, yeah, maybe I should. Well, a couple days later, I started doing some research, and within the past 5 years in the state of Pennsylvania, there were about a half a dozen officers who had received the same charge for very similar activities. Misdemeanor charge, corruption of a minor of a sexual nature, probation, that's the end of it. I thought this has got to be a joke, right? And it was different counties within Pennsylvania. It wasn't just York. I spoke to my wife and I thought, this is crazy. Who in their right mind is saying, yeah, this is okay? Teachers who do the same thing or even less, not to take away from the crimes that teachers are committing, but even lesser acts are receiving mandatory jail time. How could this be? Well, come to find out that in Pennsylvania, police officers are not considered institutional, meaning healthcare workers, teachers, coaches, people who have an ongoing relationship with a child is considered institutional. Police officers are not. I decided, all right, well, what the hell? Let's see if we're missing something here. So I had set up a meeting with our local legislator here in York, and I laid out all of these articles of these other cases. And I said, so are you okay with this? Is this all right? And Representative Diorsi just kind of looked at it and was dumbfounded. And he couldn't really believe it either. It was just mind-boggling. About a month or two later, a bill was introduced to the Pennsylvania Capitol, HB 1847. And what that does, Dave, is that closes a loophole that requires police officers that commit these crimes for them to be charged with a felony. It upgrades the charge. So corruption of a minor of a sexual nature is still considered a misdemeanor charge. But if you're a police officer, it's going to be automatically upgraded to a felony, in which case there is mandatory jail time. There is mandatory registry on the national database so that we can hold these officers accountable. Look, none of this is going to change what happened to my daughter and what my family experienced, but there is undoubtedly going to be families, again, in the state of Pennsylvania who are going to be in a similar situation. And for them to have to watch that person walk out of the courtroom, a free person, is absolutely unacceptable. We got to do something about it.
Chris, the first thing I want to say is I'm terribly, terribly sorry for the experience that your daughter had, not only with this police officer, but first of all with that student, but also her own mental anguish and torment that drove her to the point of wanting to kill herself. I'm so sorry for her. I'm sorry for you and your wife and the rest of the family. I know this must have had a tremendously difficult and trauma-based influence on the family. Mm-hmm. If I could, I'd like to go back to the student that sexually assaulted your daughter. Were you and your wife informed by your daughter right off the bat? How did her disclosure to you come about?
We were noticing a significant change in her throughout the school year. She was losing a lot of her friends. She had lost the desire to be on the volleyball team. That was really important to her, to be part of the team. And we could see a very dramatic change in her. We began to see a change in her appearance, that how she was dressing, how she was carrying herself. We were seeing all sorts of different things. Over the summer, things came to a head, and we were pretty concerned about some of the people she was hanging out with. So she had finally shared what had happened. We're What do we do? Everything that parents think they're going to do in a situation like that tends to go out the window pretty quick because now, okay, here you are, it's real. Your child has been violated in such a terrible way and they're struggling. Now, what do you do? We spoke very briefly about pressing charges, and she was adamant that that was not going to happen. That was not something she wanted to do. She just wanted to move past this. Okay, this is her decision. We want to support her, but ultimately she's got to be on board with that. So we decided not to. Like I say, we got her involved right away with therapy. And we started looking for positive outlets. Going back and getting back on the volleyball team really wasn't much of an option anymore. She was embarrassed. She was filled with shame. And we wanted to find some positive outlets, which is why the community walks just seemed like such a godsend. This is, wow, this is fantastic. And in the beginning, it really was. I mean, she was incredibly proud of the fact that she was good friends with the police commissioner. She knew a whole bunch of cops. She began talking about becoming a cop. All of a sudden, she was like, I want to do that. I want to help people. And it was having the absolute impact that we were hoping for in the beginning.
Tell me how she's doing now.
It's been just over 2 years since we found out about the assault with the officer, and it has been a journey, as you well know, and your listeners know, Dave. Coming back from a sexual assault and trauma is not easy. It is not linear. It is a journey, and she struggles. One of the things that I've learned about when dealing with trauma is that service is a fantastic way of working through trauma. Own your story, look for opportunities to help others. The work on the bill has been helpful. The number of times we share our story, it gets a little bit easier. We're able to put some distance between us and the events, and that's helpful. Having said that, we still get triggered when we're driving through downtown York and we drive past an area that we walked on the community walks. Oh, there's the little bodega that we would stop at. Everybody would run in and grab a cup of coffee or something before we finished the walk or something like that. And so we experience those, and it's triggering. My daughter gets triggered pretty easily when she sees police officers. So often with people who experience a sexual assault, what's the first thing that we tell them? Go report this to the police. You need to get law enforcement involved. Well, what do you do when the assault is at the hands of law enforcement? Mm-hmm. There are such nuances to this kind of a situation because it's not so much about the shame. While there's definitely some shame, there's the fear. There's fear that he had told her many times, I got great lawyers and nobody's going to believe you because I'm a cop, and reminding her that he carries weapons. He had the ability to make her life miserable. So what are you going to do? But here's the problem, Dave. There are nearly 650,000 law officers in the United States, and the vast majority of them are decent, hardworking men and women that are keeping our communities safe. I don't want to demonize police officers. Yeah, there are definitely bad ones out there. The challenge is that those bad ones have incredible power to do really bad things. We have to hold them accountable. If you assault an officer, it's an automatic felony because we hold our officers in high regard, as we should. However, the guy that assaulted my daughter would have gotten a more severe punishment had he stolen a car.
Yeah.
That's kind of hard to reconcile, quite frankly. It's hard to reconcile it. That's how we are treating survivors in the state of Pennsylvania and other states, for all I know.
I want to reassure the audience that your daughter knows that you're on this podcast with me and that she's on board with this.
Yes.
What are you able to tell us about that process of explaining to her what your goal was in reaching out to me and what her response was and how that conversation went and where she's at about it even now?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. She is absolutely aware. She's in support of this. She knows how important this issue is. She has gone with me to the Capitol in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to speak to legislators, to share our story so that they understand that HB 1847, there's a story behind it. There are real people that were impacted by this. She is very involved in this advocacy because none of this stuff is going to help us. None of this stuff is going to change what this guy got. But there is a possibility that this is going to help somebody else. So, Dave, when I reached out to you, one, it is to bring attention to HB 1847. I want your audience in the state of Pennsylvania to know about this, and I want them to reach out to their legislators and demand accountability, demand that this thing be taken up for a vote. Right now, it's sitting in the Judiciary Committee waiting for a vote before it can even move forward. So that's the first thing. But the second thing that we wanted to accomplish by appearing on this is to bring attention to this. You know, sexual assault is so horrific. We need to bring attention to it. We need to be talking about it. A lot of people don't want to talk about it. Well, hey, guess what, Sparky? We're going to talk about it because I'm pissed. I want people to know that we can't just say, well, that's a shame, you know, clutch our pearls and say that's an awful thing to happen. This is what's happening. We need to be talking about these things, but we also need to be placing a greater emphasis on survivors that are assaulted at the hands of law officers because we really don't talk about it. What are the numbers? Well, Dave, I can't tell you because this is so underreported. A lot of police departments will squash that real quick. So I have to give credit to Commissioner Michael Muldrow here in York. He was in absolute full support of the investigation, getting to the bottom of this. And he did not, didn't question, well, how was she dressed? Or did she invite this or anything like that? No, he knew that this is wrong, that a child is coming forward, and he was in support of that. But she also realizes that there are way too many survivors out there that are terrified of coming forward, that there are survivors that do not have the support that she has. We have a responsibility for every one of those survivors out there that somebody hasn't listened to, that somebody has dismissed because of their race, because of their socioeconomics, because of their gender, whatever the reason. We have a responsibility, and she sees that.
That's why I asked how she's doing today. I know you say she's still in therapy, and that's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that because I am such a proponent of therapy for everyone, not just trauma victims, but especially trauma victims and survivors, to know that there are ways to heal and pathways to heal. I'm wondering if maybe you can give us some insight as to G's mindset about all of this in her daily activities, in her daily thought process, in your conversations with her. I'm sure she knows that there is going to be a podcast episode. I'm just wondering if you can address for the audience some of that impact and how that process plays out in the family, because there are others who may be considering doing the same thing, not maybe with this podcast, but another podcast or a radio show or a magazine or newspaper article or whatever it is. It's, I'm sure, something that people would want to know more about in terms of the dynamics and how all of this plays out in familial relationships.
When the final hearing happened and he received a misdemeanor charge, and we're kind of left to say, okay, now what? How do we pick up the pieces of what has happened? The decision to press charges is not an easy decision, and it can be just as traumatizing. In our case, The local media had picked up the case, and because my daughter was a minor, our names were left out of it. But her classmates were able to connect the dots because the articles talked about how the child was involved in community walks. And again, she was very proud of the fact that she was involved in these community walks and she was friends with the commissioner. So her classmates were able to connect those dots, and they were able to figure out who it was. And so that was traumatizing. She'd have to meet with the DA and be asked. She had to appear in court and face the defense attorney. Traumatizing experiences. You go through all of that, and he receives a misdemeanor charge. What do you do with that? To go through therapy. My wife had got her connected with some trauma specialists. She used EMDR, which she found to be very helpful. But I had, as I did the research about the charge, none of us were happy with the plea deal. None of us were okay with it. And then I lay out all the research, which didn't take a whole lot of research to find. And I said, we need to do something about this. This was an opportunity to take a terrible situation and help somebody with it. And so she was very supportive. She wanted to make sure no other survivor had to experience that. The assault is one thing, and then the going through the process of pressing charges, and then the indignity of knowing that he walks out of the courtroom or she walks out of the courtroom a free person is just beyond the pale. Mm-hmm. So she wanted to do something about this. She wanted to make sure no other family had to experience that. When we began doing this work with the bill, I began to think about, okay, so how can we draw some attention to this? How can we put some more focus on this? And it just so happened that the Washington Post was working on an expose on sexual assault at the hands of police officers. So last October of 23, I was able to connect with the reporter, and she explained what they were doing, what the intention of these articles were all about. And when I explained about the work on the bill, she really perked up, and she said, this is a compelling story, that the assault is one part of it, but a family actually doing something about it is not typical. And I said, well, I'm pissed. This is not acceptable. And so I want to do something about this. My daughter wants to do something about this. In March of this year, the first article in this series dropped, and the writer Jessica Contreras wrote an absolutely incredible article about an officer in New Orleans that had gone to a 15-year-old's home to take her to the hospital for a rape kit to be performed. And he began grooming her, and within several months, sexually assaulted her. It was a tough article to read. I think for anyone to read that article, it is incredibly difficult. Having gone through a very similar situation, it was also very triggering because he used so many of the same tactics. He talked about wanting to be a mentor, really worked to connect with the family, and hey, I'm here to help. I'm going to be that big brother, and I understand the challenges that she's facing. And whether it's a law officer or not, these people, they have a way of identifying vulnerable people. And in that story, the officer found the child was vulnerable. She had been assaulted before, and same situation. Just figured, this is easy pickings. We decided we wanted to be part of this series. By the time this podcast drops, the article will have been published. And that's been a difficult process. We've been working with the reporter for the past 8 months. My daughter and I made the decision to have our picture appear in the article because it helps to tell the story for readers to connect with the person behind the story. Look, it has not been an easy journey. The process of retelling the stories and going through it was not easy. But what an incredible opportunity to shine a light on a situation that most people really never thought about. I mean, police officers, they're the helpers, right? They're the first ones to go in, and we're taught at an early age that the police are our friends, and come to find out, not always. So she is finding healing in this process. Some days it's hard. Some days I get very frustrated when I'm speaking to legislators and their offices and they're not returning my calls and they're brushing me off. And there are days where I say, I don't know why I'm doing this. I'm not sure I want to do this. And she will turn to me and say, if you're not going to do this, I'm not going to do this. You need to be doing this, because this is pretty important. It's not easy, but it's how we have been able to find some healing through this process. Look, it's never going to go away. It's going to be something that my daughter is going to carry with her forever. In some respects, I'm going to carry this. The level of betrayal is not insignificant, but if we are able to take this situation and help someone else, if we are able to take back the story, there's power in that. That's where the healing happens.
I agree. That's what this podcast is all about. And you said it earlier, we need to make sexual assault and rape part of our normal conversation. We need to normalize the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
We need to talk about it more. We need to talk about the impacts. We need to talk about the ways that are available to us to help diminish the strength of our rape culture, and through that, diminish the prevalence rate. And you're spot on. This is something that is horrendously difficult to deal with because of the fact that it's a police officer. I think it's important to point out that sexual predators are everywhere. They're on our police departments. They're on our fire departments. They're in our doctor's offices, in hospitals and law firms and government officials. The point of that being, we don't know how many sexual predators are in our own communities and what they're doing, but we need to be talking about it more so that when the opportunity arises for laws to be changed, awareness to be made, we take advantage of that and we do everything we can, like you're doing for your daughter, to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. It's part of why I was asking what the impact is on your daughter, because I want this to be a positive thing for her, and it sounds like it is. And that instead of dwelling on how difficult it was and how horrible it was, we can build each other up and use these situations to make changes to eliminate rape culture. I think that's the goal.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate the time and effort. I know how difficult this is because I've lived it myself. I may not know the exact details of your trauma and G's trauma, but I do know there are some commonalities in sexual trauma, and that we need to formulate these communities and coalitions and groups of victims and survivors and those who support victims and survivors to strengthen the message. So I think what you're doing is extremely commendable, and I commend G for her willingness to allow her story to be told through you. I would hope that sometime in the future, she's able to come on this show and tell her own story and be a part of this podcast and feel the strength of community from others who will rally around her, as you and your wife are, and those who are helping you get this story out, because I think it would be tremendously helpful for her. And I know it would be tremendously helpful to other victims and survivors who are listening to this. Chris, what else is there that you would like my listeners to hear?
I'm glad you asked that. To something you were just saying, how they are in our community, there are politicians and lawyers and whatnot. So in the final hearing, my wife and I were able to read our victim impact statements. I actually read my daughter's impact statement because she did not want to be at that final hearing. So I read her statement and I read my statement. And in my statement, I talked about a father's number one priority, number one job is to protect their kids. We make sure that they put their seatbelts on when they're riding their bike. They got to wear a helmet. We dress them up and we send them out into the world, and we hope we've done a good job. A parent's job is to protect their child. And I failed in that job. I did not protect my child. And logically, I know I never would have been able to know this, but the heart is not always on board with that. And I mentioned that in my impact statement. And the judge had said to me, Mr. McGhee, evil wears a mask. You had no way of knowing. There's truth to that. Parents or loved ones of survivors, there could be a lot of guilt there. We could have done more. We had a suspicion, this person didn't look right, or, maybe if I had just, whatever it is, that you just don't know. There are days when I can tell you, what, Dave, there's no way I could have known. And evil is all around us. And there are days when I'm going to tell you, boy, did I fuck up. I really dropped the ball. It's something that is just below the surface. But when I do things like this, when I share our story, when I call up legislators and ask them to do their damn job and protect the citizens, when I bring awareness to this situation, I am, in a way, trying to give myself a pass, maybe absolve myself of some of those sins, because it's normal. It's hard to argue with the parent or the loved one of a survivor to tell them it's not their fault. They couldn't see this coming. And logically, yep, you're right. But at the end of the day, that little voice in your head sometimes is a little louder than other times. So it's an ongoing struggle.
I hear what you're saying, and I totally am compassionate and empathic with your viewpoints and your comments, because I've been in that same boat too. That's another boat that I share. I think what's important to dwell on, and I do this in my own brain and hope that I can pass this on to you and other parents and loved ones of survivors, that what we as a society and as family members and community members need to do is start laying the blame at the feet of the perpetrators. And doing what you're doing, like you said, is a huge part of that. By doing what you can to pass HB 1847 and doing what you can to imprint upon judges' minds and prosecutors' minds and other police officers' minds that this is a crime that cannot be tolerated, that it should have zero tolerance. This is a crime that we should do everything we can do to bring justice to survivors, but accountability justice to perpetrators. That doesn't always mean jail, but in certain circumstances, where the level of trust of police and other prominent office holders are held to a different standard because of ill-written laws, these changes need to be made. And what you're doing is commendable. And you need to keep reminding yourself of that.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. But here's the thing. I'm a pissed off dad, and I'm doing my job. If your kid burns themselves on the stove, you need to go and remove the knobs from the stove. You got to make sure that you do something to make sure it doesn't happen again. I have to do this for my own healing. I have to do this for my daughter's healing. And I have to do this for the other survivors.
Yeah, and I'm glad you are.
I also have a lot of folks that will talk about, this is so brave. I'm not brave. Bravery happens when you got something to lose. I've got nothing to lose. But I will say this. If my daughter is able to deal with the things that she has dealt with, to sit in court and speak to the defense attorney, to stare down the person that did this to her, if she is able to participate in an article with the Washington Post to bring light to this, I've got the easy part. I got my kid to look up to. She's the one that deserves the accolades. I'm just doing what I would hope any pissed off citizen would do. Takes issue with the fact that we are not holding officers accountable. I would hope other people would take issue with this.
Absolutely. And I do want to commend your daughter also for allowing you to be the mouthpiece on this podcast, but also to the legislature. And in that article that you mentioned that's coming out in the Washington Post, she's strong. to be in the situation she's in and still wanting to make sure that this doesn't happen to someone else. I would hope that you would pass that on to her from me, that I admire her and her strength and resilience and desire to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So pass that on to her. She's amazing.
She's a bit of a badass. I'm pretty impressed with her.
Yeah, so am I. Well, Chris, I can't thank you enough for reaching out to me. It's been an honor to talk to you. It's been an honor to hear of your daughter. And it's an honor to be able to put this episode out for others to hear and become aware and do what they can to maybe fix things in their own community.
Well, Dave, I need to thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share our story and let other survivors know that they're not alone. There's a community out there that love them and support them and that are fighting for them. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
It's been totally my pleasure. Chris, let's plan on having you back. I would love to hear an update on what's going on with that bill and what the legislature did with it. I would love to be able to hear more about situation G finds herself in 8 months from now, 10 months from now, and get an update on how things are going for you and her and your entire family.
Would love that. I look forward to being able to share some good news with you next time, but mark my words, if it is not passed this year, I am going to do it all again next year. And once it is passed, we're going to start looking at the next law. We want to make people do their job. So I look forward to being able to come back and share an update, let you know what's going on.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Dave.
We'll talk to you again.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I want to thank Chris McGhee again for reaching out to me and telling the story of G's sexual assaults. I'm extremely hopeful that this episode will have a positive impact on getting Pennsylvania House Bill 1847 passed this year. Chris and his daughter G are setting an amazing example of what it means to do their parts in helping bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. I encourage you to do the same. A great way for everyone to get involved is to start by believing when it comes to listening to or supporting someone who tells you their sexual assault or rape story, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. And please subscribe, rate, and share this podcast with everyone you know. I truly appreciate your help in making this podcast grow. We'll see you next week.